Hey guys, ILS007 here. Just wanted to make a very quick video about ICMIZER to let you guys know why it's much better software than all the others out there and how it's helping me and my students make a lot of money. First of all, just to quickly mention independent chip model, ICM. This is what everybody's known about for the last few years and essentially calculates the value of shoving compared to the value of folding in a hand and tells you the correct decision based on that. And important to note that it only calculates the hand that you're on and doesn't take account of future hands that can happen. By comparison, and what's emerged quite recently is what's called the predictive simulation model, or PSM. And basically the difference is it will calculate future scenarios to determine what you should do now. So in that sense, it seems to be a more kind of all-encompassing calculation, including future value with present value. But important to note in this model that it uses estimated Nash ranges for future hands, and we'll get into that in a little while. About now actually. Yeah, basically with PSM using default Nash ranges, the calculations it makes for future hands are going to be really inaccurate. Basically Nash ranges give you an idea of how wide somebody should be shoving and how wide the opponent would be calling based on what's called Nash equilibrium. And that's a model which assumes that the only two available plays are to push or to fold, and it doesn't take account of any spots where an opponent could have a min-raising range or could have a limping range, which would really change the range that they're open shoving and open folding. So basically, using that assumption for all future hands, for all players, is going to be a real approximation and very inaccurate in a lot of spots. It also doesn't take account of other factors that could make a play bad, even though it's technically a good shove based on Nash equilibrium. For example, if you're against somebody that's a very bad player, you might be able to get a much bigger edge by passing up on a very thin spot, knowing that you're going to get a lot more chips in future hands just by abusing them. So here's a couple of examples to put it in perspective and what we're talking about here. So imagine that it's a 6-max sit and go tournament, and the big stack can abuse the shorter stacks from the small blind by shoving very wide based on Nash. But the big stack happens to be a nitty fish. Well, what's the outcome of this? Well, the outcome is that the fish is not going to shove as wide as he should do because he doesn't realize how wide he could shove based on Nash. And therefore, the guy in the big blind is going to get a lot more walks than what the PSM calculation would otherwise think. So that it's easy to visualize, here it is, the exact same situation we're describing. And we're the hero in the big blind who is the short stack. We're going to get a lot more folds than we would otherwise expect. And what does that mean? Well, it means that with a hand like pocket twos, which we might otherwise think we have to call, all of a sudden, against somebody that's shoving wide, tighter, we're going to have to call tighter because our hand doesn't play as well, but we're also going to make a lot of money when he folds in future scenarios. So he's going to basically be our piggy bank, just giving us a few chips every here and there and keeping us alive, whereas most aggressive players would be shoving in a small blind constantly, and then we'd eventually become a crippled stack. So there's two completely different scenarios unfolding, and PSM is not going to take account of this. Whereas if we use the ICM calculator, we can see that pocket twos would very clearly be a fold, because what the ICM calculator is doing is just simply saying, this guy's shoving X range, can we call? And the answer is no. We might make an adjustment for the fact that if we keep folding, we're going to become really short stacked, and therefore we might be willing to take some kind of negative edge. So with a hand like threes, certainly we could justify calling. With a hand like twos, it might also be justifiable if the guy's on like any two cards. And in this situation here, I put him on 92%, which would be the default Nash range. But if we take the tight fish, and he's only shoving, for example, 50%, which I think is perfectly reasonable to assume, then not only would pocket twos be a clear fold, but pocket threes would now also be a clear fold. And PSM calculator will not give you this answer. PSM calculator will say, if you keep folding these spots, you're just going to become really crippled stack because this guy's just going to keep shoving and abusing you. Whereas the reality is this guy's a tight fish, and actually in future simulations he's going to be folding too much, so it's going to be the exact opposite in fact. Okay, one more scenario just to crystallize this. So this one, once again, is the bubble of a 6-max sit and go. But in this one, we're second in chips, and third place has far less chips than us. So let's just quickly go to the hand, it'll be easier to look at. The guy in the big blind is an abusing reg. What that means is he understands what's going to happen in the future because he's a magician, and he can make a lot more money with taking advantage of spots where he can abuse. And this is one of them. Basically what he says is, I might as well just fold here because the other two stacks are going to be very close to each other and I can keep stealing in the future. They're going to both have to fold really, really tight because they can't afford to bust before the other guy does. It's a bubble, they can't afford to lose here. So basically he's taking advantage of the fact that those guys can't call wide in the future. And whereas based on Nash, he should be calling with any two cards here. That's right, deuce 3 off will be a call for this guy. And PSM calculator is assuming that every time this guy gets into this situation, he's going to call with any two cards, and that guy in the small blind is going to be risking his tournament life. Whereas in reality, I'm not saying he's going to fold 10-8 offsuit here, although it's possible, but if he's folding, say, the bottom 20-30% of hands, that small blind is going to take down his pot like nearly 1 in 3 times, and that's going to be a much different situation to what PSM is assuming, where that guy's got 0 fold equity in the small blind. And what does that mean? Well, it means that when you're on the button in second place, you're going to have to shove a little bit wider than what's recommended. Because if you keep folding, expecting the short stack to go bust, this guy in the big blind could just keep giving him free chips just so you can keep this abusing scenario going. And that's going to destroy your tournament. And I just gave an example of what kind of range the reg might call with. I didn't make him fold 10-8, but I made him fold, for example, 9-4 off, or worse hands than that. So still folding over 1 in 5 times with that range. So I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to this and thinking, well, you're saying all the negative things about PSM, but you're not mentioning the fact that ICM also has a huge flaw. And that's correct, and it's also been pointed out already. The fact that ICM is only calculating the value of the present hand. It's not even thinking about the future. So maybe PSM is actually getting the future situations wrong in its assessment, but at least it's trying to make an effort to do that. Whereas ICM is not taking any account of that, so that could be an even bigger error, is the argument. But I'm going to suggest why I don't think that's the case. Well, the difference is basically that ICMIZER allows you to fix that problem. Okay, the fix is not going to be perfect, it's going to be a bit of guesswork and it's going to be an estimate, but it is going to be an adjustment. If you use a calculation which you can't adjust manually, and you're just hoping that that pre-programmed simulation is correct, if it's incorrect, well, tough luck, you've got a bad calculation. But if you know intuitively when looking at an ICM calculation what kind of error it has because it doesn't realize, for example, you're the big stack and you can abuse, or if you fold, the other guy's going to keep abusing you, well, you can say, well, my calculation's wrong, but I'm going to fix it a bit. And what the result's going to be is a much less bad calculation than the PSM one. So what I'm saying is that both calculations can't be perfect, and I think that's the nature of this, and that's what people have to realize. These calculations are giving us much more accurate ranges in poker these days, but it's not perfection. There's definitely error in all these calculations, and there always will be. I'll go on to that a bit later. So a few criticisms for people that are still skeptical about what I'm saying. First one could be, well, how can you define the edge that you're going to use on ICMIZER? It's complete guesswork and it's arbitrary. Second criticism, well, maybe there's nothing special about ICMIZER because Sit and Go Wizard pretty much does the same thing. Why are you making such a big fuss about this one? And then finally, well, surely the inaccuracy of this calculation is going to be worse than the inaccuracy of PSM's calculation, and I've already discussed that. Okay, so with the first one, well, I've also touched on that. Edge factor is very hard to quantify. A lot of it is down to intuition, but I think the most simple way I can explain is that many things in science weren't known until we tried and tested them. The only way we could find out what was true was by falsifying them. So you put them to the test and you find whether they pass the test, and if they do, you know that maybe it's reliable. And I think the same thing applies with these calculations to an extent. If you play 5,000 games and you find that by making this adjustment it makes you more money, you can be pretty confident that that was a good adjustment to make. So I think it's definitely the case that you can use trial and error successfully, and it shouldn't be considered just complete guesswork. Yeah, it's making an approximation, it is an estimate, but it's not a complete guess, it's certainly an educated guess. And with regards to the second criticism, well, the biggest single difference between ICMIZER and Sit and Go Wizard is that ICMIZER allows fully customizable ranges, whereas with Sit and Go Wizard, you have to drag the bar along and it will give you a default range based on the percentage that you give. But that's going to be really, really inaccurate in lots of situations. And at the bottom, I've just written there the difference between shoving high card hands or live hands. So what you'll find is that when you're a short stack, quite often you want to shove stuff that will play quite well. And what we mean by that is like suited hands, for example. Whereas the guy who calls you might deliberately be looking for hands that will beat that range, you know, like ace high hands or king high hands. So basically, the guy who's shoving a wide range and the guy who's calling a wide range, they've both got similar kind of percentage ranges, perhaps, in terms of what they're shoving and what they're calling. But the nature of those hands in that range is completely different. So if you use the typical Sklansky-Chubakov default, it's going to be way wrong for both of those guys. And with regards to the third criticism, I've already touched on that, but I think it's very important to remember that scientific method doesn't just mean that you can't use trial and error. Trial and error is a part of science, and also if you can benefit from intuition as well as using a calculator, that's going to be a lot more profitable than just having to rely on a calculation which has got a lot of error in it. So I think it's a combination of the two approaches which can give you the best rewards. So what's the future of ICM and PSM? Well, I think the immediate thought that springs to mind is that basically PSM might not be that good now, but surely it's going to improve in the future, you know. Various calculations will be tweaked, and when it becomes more accurate, it's going to be the best way of doing things. However, I'd like to offer a different perspective on this. I think it's important to remember that you could put all the relevant factors in the equation and you could improve on these and make them more accurate. But ultimately, if players are going to vary when they become aggressive and when they become tight, and situations are going to yield more profit in the future based on how bad the average player at the table is, or whether you're against very good players at that table, well, these are not static factors, they're variables. And how can a calculator vary these according to that specific situation? There's no kind of algorithm that can calculate that for the exact table that you're at. It doesn't know whether that player in that guy's mind is going to decide to go on monkey tilt in that situation when he can't accept that extra bad beat that he's finally taken. There's no way it can, you know, account for that. Whereas as a human, and we get to see the kind of bet sizes he started to make at the table, and maybe he's typed something in the chat, well, that's a much more strong indication of what that guy's thinking in his head. And I think we have to use a combination of both these approaches for it to work. And that's why I'm always going to favor a calculation where I can make a manual adjustment based on what I know at the table. So just to wrap this up, basically poker is a game of imperfect information, unlike chess. You know, in chess you can have all the factors and all the calculations put together, and it doesn't matter what the opponent does, those plays are going to be correct, objectively correct, no matter what he does. He can't bluff us to make the play bad. Whereas in poker, because it's a game of imperfect information, when our opponent mixes things up, even if his play is, you know, objectively incorrect, if we don't know exactly what it is that he's doing and what hand he has, that can become a good play. And finally, just to touch on game theory, which is where Nash equilibrium comes from, I think it's a very useful tool, but the problem is, like I said earlier, it assumes that there's only pushing and folding options in the game, only two options, whereas whenever you add extra complexity to the equation, it's going to be wrong. But the more important factor is just to remember, it assumes that everybody in the game is rational, and the whole nature of poker is that with imperfect information, the way that we can beat other players is because, based on the information that we're all given, which is limited, we have different perceptions or we have different levels of ability, and inherently that means that game theory is not going to be correct because some players are playing better than others, quite simply, and nobody's prescribing to an equilibrium, otherwise there'd be no money. All the money would be passed around equally to the sites that we pay rate to. So anyway, I've gone on for too long. I hope this video has been useful and kind of opened your eyes to some of the things that haven't really been considered in the poker community for the last year or so.